Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar. I'm just going to let the room fill up just a minute. Be back with you shortly. All right, let's dive in. Today's webinar is called Reducing Fleet Management Burden, Exploring Personal Cars for Select Drivers. It's presented by CarData. Oh, and by the way, I'm Chris Brown, Associate Publisher for Automotive Fleet. I'll be your moderator for today's event. I encourage you all to ask questions. You can do that during the webinar at any point. You'll see that box to ask questions. You guys know the drill, okay? Listen, if we don't get to the questions, don't worry. We'll certainly contact you by email and get your response after the event. So today, I am pleased to be joined by Lee Adam. She's Director of Product Marketing for CarData. And let me just mention, too, that Haywood Marsh couldn't make it today, but you're in great hands with Lee. Lee, tell us a little bit more about CarData and yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Happy to be here. Love working with Automotive Fleet and happy to be representing CarData and helping to, help the group navigate reimbursement solutions and personal vehicle solutions. So quick introduction to myself, Lee Adam, Director of Product Marketing. I've been at CarData for just over 3 years now, feels like forever. I work very closely with customers and prospective customers alike to essentially design reimbursement and personal vehicle policies that best meet their unique needs. So their industry, what their people do, right? In order to set best practices and uphold best practices based on what makes sense. And a perfect segue is, what does CarData do? Well, of course, that. CarData is the fully managed solution for personal vehicle and mileage reimbursements. So organizations who have people on the road for work utilizing personal vehicles, that's our bread and butter. So everything between program design to the technology and the software that enables you to essentially help your people drive their personal cars for work. So mileage capture, reporting technology, and of course, getting them paid for that business mileage. So it's a little bit about CarData, and you'll learn a lot more about what we do in today's presentation as we walk through.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Lee. I'm going to go off camera and mute myself, and Lee's going to give a presentation that I'm going to come back on later, and we can take some questions and have a conversation. So have at it, Lee.
Thank you, Chris. Amazing. Okay, thanks everybody for having us today. Really excited to dive in and help you navigate how to reduce your fleet management burden in a way that makes sense for you, for your business, for your organization. So thank you for joining today's webinar. And as Chris mentioned, ask all the questions you'd like in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get to them at the end of today's presentation. So today we're going to be exploring how opening a personal vehicle program, a vehicle reimbursement option for the use of those personal vehicles can reduce your burden, can lower your costs, streamline operations, and increase the flexibility for your team. All while, of course, keeping your employees happy and ensuring compliance with relevant tax regulations. So today we're asking the question, does everyone in your fleet really need a vehicle? Do they need that vehicle to be assigned? Do they need to take that vehicle home? Are your fleet practices effectively adapting as your business needs grow and as the economy grows and as the economy changes? And would a more flexible, cost-efficient, and streamlined vehicle program benefit you and some of your mobile employees? So I'm excited today to share some actionable insights on when to know it's time to explore these reimbursement options, because mixed fleets are growing, but it can be challenging to know when it's going to be right for you. We'll also talk about the most common tax-free models in 2025 and how to make the transition from a strictly company vehicle approach to some of those personal vehicle reimbursements really being married in beautifully and make that as smooth as possible. Plus, we're going to walk through some examples of mixed approaches for organizations that are looking to maintain a seamless policy for both. And again, I introduced myself, Director of Product Marketing at CarData. Been here for a long time working with businesses. We all know that every single business is different. Every industry is different. So as we navigate this conversation today, we're going to talk a little bit about how to apply this to your real life, to your scenarios in order to reduce your burden further. So a little bit of more history about Car Data. We've been in business since 1999, over 25 years, and we work with companies to design, scale, and optimize their personal vehicle reimbursement programs. So we've worked with organizations between major enterprise organizations to smaller family companies, pairing our IRS and CRA expertise with data and simple software to build the best fitting end-to-end reimbursement policies and processes to essentially pay mobile employees fairly and tax-free. So tailored programs include fixed and variable rate reimbursement, tax-free car allowances, and of course, basic cents per mile reimbursement, which we're going to be learning about today. But why are we having this conversation? Well, data shows that 30% of eligible non-commercial company vehicles will transition to personal vehicles over the next 3 years. So today we're going to be discussing who, why, and how these transitions will take place. And we'll explore how fleet managers like you can appropriately incorporate personal vehicle programs and reimbursement to support optimization where it makes sense without disrupting operations or adding complexity, ultimately making your jobs easier and making your employees more satisfied. So today we're going to be diving into the evolution of fleet, key considerations specifically in 2025 and going into 2026. We're going to look at comparing traditional fleet to reimbursement strategies, talk about the rise of key models that are going to be coming into light in the next couple of years and some IRS regulations that impact that. And we're also going to talk about transition management and leveraging tools to make this as easy as possible from start to finish. So here's a little bit of an overview of what you'll walk away having learned, focusing on understanding how and when to utilize personal vehicles to ultimately accomplish a couple things, right? Number one, reducing cost creep, such as insurance costs. Two, managing liability and off-the-clock risks, reducing time, right? Time spent on managing these programs by managing processes efficiently, keeping you focused on your core job and some of your larger commercial fleets. And of course, increasing flexibility and fairness to keep your people happy, right? If you're going to make a change, you have to make sure that that change is going to be absorbed well. You need to make sure it's fair. You need to make sure you keep your key people happy on the road. So now that we've outlined what we're going to cover, let's take a step back and talk about what a fleet really is today, because that definition is changing. So fleets aren't just about managing assets, right? It's not just about managing assets and now safety, which we know is of increasing importance for everybody. Fleets should encompass full mobility management strategies and optimizing how your employees actually move for work. And that's all your employees, right? And of course, these strategies are going to parallel other market trends we've seen about emphasizing flexibility and adjusting to employee preferences and working to reduce company risks and costs so that you have a scalable and agile solution that's ready as your business grows. So let's start by comparing what makes a traditional fleet as defined today to a reimbursement program where we're utilizing personal vehicles. Let's just segment those out and really look at them separately. So let's start with the scenario in which a company purchases or leases a group of vehicles. Now, in this specific situation, we're going to be talking about light-duty non-commercial vehicles, right? Cars that could hypothetically be replaced with personal cars. So light-duty non-commercial vehicles used for the purpose of visiting points of call, right? So sales reps, customer stops, service technician, engineering projects, things of that nature, right? So regardless of whether the vehicles are leased or owned, this setup often comes along with high fixed costs like initial acquisition and procurement, which can cost, tens of thousands of dollars. Not even looking at things like lengthy contracts, it's difficult to get out of those. It also has high operating costs like fuel, maintenance, reconditioning, accident repairs, and insurance. And we're talking vehicles that aren't necessarily equipped, right? And this requires a lot of management. You are likely responsible for overseeing not just the vehicles themselves, but the entire operation, right? So liability, safety, asset tracking, and today, even sustainability goals associated with those vehicles. And of course, there are pros to having control of your company's brand image for your passenger vehicles, right? Your vehicles that aren't commercial, when drivers specifically are out on the road visiting customers. There are pros to that. There's also pros to managing safety head on with things like dash cams and speed monitors and other surveillance systems, which we know are all privacy questionable for the modern driver who likes to speak up and say, hey, I don't love that, right? You guys hear it most. But there's a level of control that exists there. But it's not necessarily control over your time and control over your costs. So when a reimbursement model is included, employees bring their personal vehicles to work, and the business only pays for the work-related use of that vehicle. This means that business trips are the only things that are reimbursed along with that business mileage. That means no more paying for personal use, no more off-hour liability concerns, no more management of that fleet if it's not directly related to business use. Instead, employees are simply reimbursed for expenses related to doing their job, right? And they're done so completely tax-free when you do it right. And we're all about doing things right here. We need to reduce our cost and make sure that we're paying people appropriately. And this, of course, is only suited for employees who are using non-specialty vehicles like SUVs, sedans, or pickup trucks. Often, again, sales reps, service reps, or management. So before we dive into reimbursement alternatives that leverage the use of an employee's personal vehicle specifically, of course, I don't have to tell you guys twice, it's important to note that there are going to be times where maintaining a typical company-managed fleet will be the best fitted solution. And I want to take time to talk about this here. The first case is that, these driving employees have jobs that require heavy usage of their vehicle in a specialty format, right, to execute their job. For example, drivers in commercial trucks, rigged vehicles, hauling big loads that can never be replaced, right? In this modern era, not yet, right? Other examples are when company vehicles might actually fit the bill best is when they use branded vehicles, right? So whether these vehicles are pooled or provided to each employee for business and personal use, these vehicles are often included in a marketing investment that can, sometimes be hard to adjust. My favorite example of including when a more of a sedan type vehicle could be used for marketing purposes is those Red Bull cars. They have those big cans on the top. Yeah, very challenging to make a change there when you're managing your fleet, even though you might say, hey, there's no reason this couldn't be personal. Well, a big marketing investment, right? And of course, for some companies is of high importance. Other companies, they see the risk associated with giving somebody a branded vehicle to take home on the weekends, especially if they've gotten in an accident, which believe me, I've seen in my years here. But of course, wanting to keep a strong, visible unification of your fleet is a good reason to consider keeping some of those non-specialty vehicles as company provided. But there's other ways to do that with policy. However, I will note that the most important thing to consider when you're determining whether a fleet vehicle or a personal vehicle may make the most sense is when you understand and can easily decipher the real use threshold, the real job requirement threshold, and the real mileage threshold that might indicate a person may need a vehicle under one of the scenarios I mentioned above, or actually financially qualify for a company provided vehicle when compared to other field enablement alternatives. So ask yourself the question, can the financial benefits of providing a company vehicle still outweigh the costs, especially when compared to reimbursement options, which I'm going to take you through today? And this is going to really help us understand and get comfortable with the practice of measuring reimbursement versus the total cost of ownership of a current vehicle, doing that comparison and deciphering where that real use threshold really makes sense for your organization when you jump off the webinar today. But I will also note that both programs, whether it's a company provided vehicle or personal vehicle reimbursement, can be attractive benefits to employees if they're well designed and if they're well managed. But I want to take a minute and talk about why reimbursement is growing so much. So what's leading the charge behind companies integrating personal vehicle programs with their fleet strategy? We talked about that 30% mark. Why is that happening? So looking back into the full year of 2024, lots of data there. In 2024, businesses encountered a range of issues with their fleet operations. And for roles where having an assigned vehicle is a perk and not a requirement, companies were thinking differently about how to handle mobility there. Right, so businesses saw insurability issues and rising costs after accidents. That was one of the #1 reported challenges in 2024. Of course, underutilized assets are also a challenge, right? There's more data coming in with regards to utilization and being able to track that effectively. And if you have assets that are sitting idle, that hits your bottom line. A lot of fleet managers were also frustrated by rigid contracts and continue to experience procurement delays due to the international supply chain market. And VRPs, vehicle reimbursement programs, allow businesses to pay fairly for work-related driving without the burden of managing a hard asset, the cost, the liability, and the management that comes with it for you. So let's take a quick look closer into how inflation has been impacting different aspects of vehicle ownership. And this is some data from the last couple full years. So beyond just premiums, we're seeing rising costs in vehicle prices, repairs, and accident-related expenses, all of which contribute to a more expensive and riskier driving environment overall. And so for companies with larger commercial fleets, that means higher financial exposure, especially when accidents might happen not on the clock for people who are unable to take home some vehicles. And that's a risk, right? This overview really shows us inflation rates broken down into different aspects of owning a vehicle. And 44% of companies with fleets are seeing rising costs or total cost of ownership as their top challenge in the last couple of years. So let's summarize our discussion so far. Although company vehicles are very well suited for specific situations, right? Commercial use, branded vehicles, really heavy used equipment, right? A lot of those scenarios we talked about earlier, they don't fit the bill for all driving related activities. And us as fleet managers in 2025, going to 2026, have to look at all work and all mobility as one unified strategy. So, of course, to summarize, drawbacks include significant corporate risk and liability, including personal use, personal time, and on-the-job behavior, right? Rising costs to purchase and maintain vehicles, both owned and leased, whether it was after, should not be named, whether it was after the COVID pandemic or in today's changing economic climate, costs are unstable. It's challenging for us to anticipate the cost of turnover or, getting a new part in for a unified fleet. It's challenging to anticipate that and the time associated with it. That brings me to vehicle procurement and sourcing limitations. Traditional fleets, specifically of sedans and SUVs, sometimes can't keep up with business expansion and the need to change over vehicles and to turn over with retention cycles as needed, right? This all becomes more important as the global supply chain is changing and as our need to optimize increases. And of course, we'll also note there is a lack of choice with drivers. And people do value choice these days. They want to know that their lifestyle is supported by their organization, specifically salespeople, right? Their family size, their work hours, their driving preferences. When you're in a uniform fleet, it can be challenging to support that. And of course, I don't need to say this twice to you guys, time-consuming operational management. As your company grows, and that's the goal, right? Our companies grow, you'll face more burden. Your burden will grow too. So if your fleet isn't optimized for utilization, where you're reducing idle assets, where you're reducing total cost of ownership, you'll find it challenging really to grow with the pace of your talent, to grow with the pace of your organization. So it's really important to look at who should and shouldn't have a company car. So these are just a few of the reasons why fleet managers are shifting away from only offering traditional company car programs, and they're really bringing in that personal vehicle approach in a option that is going to be able to keep them streamlined and, of course, keep them focused on their core job. And overall, about 30 cents on every dollar is lost when fleet vehicles are leveraged in the wrong scenarios. So let's talk about reimbursement. Reimbursement programs are typically leveraged as an option to complement or to essentially replace a less ideal approach to mobility enablement, like company cars when they aren't required in certain scenarios. And I will note, and I've said this before, but I'll note it again, every company functions differently. However, there is a range of commonly used field enablement programs, of course, company cars. Other things you might hear in the space. Well, if I'm going to give them a personal car, maybe I'll give them a taxable car allowance. Well, car allowances waste 37% to taxes across, income tax, across employee contributions of FICA and FUTA taxes and employer contributions. You're opening up a can of worms with a taxable car allowance, right? If you want to give them a personal car. Other people will say, yeah, give them a personal car, we'll give them manual mileage submissions, or they can just, ad hoc submit their expenses, which can waste over 25% on estimation, So there's a lot of options that exist for mobility enablement in the space, but the main problems here are the lack of accountability and the improper cost allocation associated with these options. They kind of just exist, but they're not managed. And we all know it's really important to understand your data and understand your costs so you can manage them appropriately. So with a lot of these options you're seeing on the screen, taxable car allowances, manual expense submissions, manual mileage tracking, it's often unclear whether the cost of the program is justified by its use, so by what your drivers are actually doing, and whether its use is justified and appropriately allocated to the cost. So are you spending too much, too little, just right, and why? And this exists a lot of the time when you're giving perk vehicles. You don't really know if what you're paying for the car is worth it, right? You don't know if there's value there. And the results of this, unnecessary corporate liability, risk of over and underspending. Again, you don't know what you don't know. Equity and turnover risks due to the lack of market data often used to set these policies. And not to mention, of course, I'll say it again, the tax waste associated with giving somebody a flat allowance or a flat amount without the appropriate tax measures being followed. And it's because of that companies are turning to accountable and tax compliant vehicle reimbursement policies that enable them to allow for personal vehicles, but in a way that reduces ambiguity, allows them to stay true with company and corporate policy, and also allows them to pay in a way that is fair and actually makes sense with what people do for work and what people are required to do for their job. So let's get into it. Let's talk about tax-free programs for personal vehicles. Now, there are 3 reimbursement methods as recognized in the United States under the IRS and, Canada today, although they're managed a little bit differently from a taxability perspective across North America. And now every single company, all of your people who are on the road today, your field sales representatives, your service technicians, they're going to have different territory sizes, customer site locations, various driving frequency, and also vehicle requirements depending on the equipment or the type of assets that they're lugging around. And they're also going to have different success metrics, rather, of what is important for them in terms of their job. And these factors really need to be taken into account. There's never a one-size-fits-all for companies. But the best way to increase the financial efficiency of your program and to ace the inclusion of personal cars and making your job a lot easier is to really select the best program based on your employees' behaviors. And we'll be sharing tips today on how to decipher this and how to figure that out in a way that best makes, of course, your job easier and their jobs easier as well. So starting on the right side here, we have cents per mile reimbursement. Everybody in the group here is probably aware of this, have seen this before. Cents per mile, basic mileage reimbursement. This is best suited for low mileage occasional drivers and is tax-free on captured business miles. So I hop in my car, I capture my mileage, I get paid for every single mile on a per mile rate. Typical. A lot of people are experienced with this. We'll talk about this a bit in the next couple slides here. Second, we have tax-free car allowance, which can support a payment in being tax-free using IRS publication 463 in the United States. More on this later. And the most common vehicle reimbursement policy and approach is fixed and variable rate reimbursement, which when done correctly is 100% tax-free and leverages up-to-date cost data. And is also the most common approach for making the switch from somebody in a take-home perk vehicle to a reimbursement program in their personal car. And a lot more on this later. Each program requires effective business mileage reporting, and software tools exist to help make this easy for you. Because at the core of reimbursement, at the most basic fundamental element of reimbursement, there's really 2 things. Number 1 is a policy written that really describes the regulations with regards to personal vehicle use. And number 2 is mileage capture, is visibility over what is actually being done for work use. And tools exist to help this in a full cycle way. And before we get into each one of these reimbursement policies one by one, I just want to take a second to talk about why these are tax-free and why people even care to approach these as unique entities, besides the fact that the IRS or the CRA tells us that they can be in specific scenarios. So the key reason that reimbursement is considered the best approach for personal vehicles is that, unlike compensation, right, reimbursement is supposed to cover cost. It's supposed to be directly attributed to company required work. And again, unlike compensation, it's not considered income because it's supposed to cover what the company defines as company required work, right? So essentially, it's defined by the organization. And you can think about your reimbursement program as a company's formal receipt for the costs it covers when using a personal vehicle. And when paired with really strong regulation, really well-written policy about the use of personal vehicles, the upkeep of personal vehicles, it can be a really great and attractive program for people. And again, that said, although the fact it covers cost, it can also be a really attractive strategic benefit for employees, because when you're using market data to create reimbursement rates, which is what I'm going to talk to you about throughout the presentation, you can make the transition from having a perk vehicle to having a well reimbursed, consistent cash flow in your pocket every month and being able to drive your own, BMW at home. You can make that really attractive and smooth for your people. So now that we understand that, let's start by looking at the most basic reimbursement type, which I alluded to before. Cents per mile reimbursement, okay? So if you're gonna open up a personal car approach for select drivers at your organization, this is the most fundamental basic approach to reimbursement. It really just means pairing a driver submitted mileage directly to a basic per mile rate. So as a driver submits mileage, every mile is then multiplied by that rate. Basic, you guys get it. This strategy, though, is ideal for the occasional driver. So this is somebody who hops in a vehicle once in a while to visit a customer or run a work errand. Why? Well, cents per mile is really best designed for those who are driving under 5,000 miles per year. These would be considered low mileage or casual drivers for all intents and purposes under the guidance of IRS regulations and how their publications can be navigated. That's because most companies who use this approach to mileage reimbursement pair it with the IRS standard mileage rate, which is 70 cents in 2025. It's typically updated annually. So most people use the IRS standard rate because it essentially represents the national average cost of driving across America, right? The IRS comes out with it every year. It represents an average across a very wide range of states. But of course, companies can pay up to this rate per mile and be permitted to do so completely tax-free. No tax in the exchange. As long as I'm using 70 cents or below per business mile, I can go ahead and reimburse that tax-free. Great. This is often a simple approach, quite simple, and it's the perfect fit for a person who's driving occasionally, right? Because they don't have much financial burden or fixed costs associated with their vehicle because they don't use it that often for work. So when pairing this per mile strategy with effective reporting tools and simple capture methods, reimbursements are 100% tax-free on business mileage, easy. You guys are no longer responsible for managing the turnover of that vehicle, the asset tracking. They can use their personal car, easy. However, when we creep over that 5,000 mile mark, now we're talking about employees who drive more frequently, right? And you start to see maybe a more mid-mileage or high mileage group come to life. That's where ROI and fairness and then asset burden and all these management challenge start to come into consideration. So the IRS standard rate doesn't take into account the frequent fluctuations of living costs, such as maintenance costs, fuel costs in different areas. It also doesn't take into account the real impact of things like depreciation, right? So the more you drive, the more you depreciate your car. So if you're using a fixed rate, it can be challenging, right? It's just that. It's a national average. That means some drivers are going to take home way more than they need as they rack up miles, like more and more and more, right? But realistically, it's not an exponential curve that your vehicle is depreciated with every mile, right? Your fixed costs don't go up exponentially. And others are going to take home a lot less than they need, right? Based on the cost in their area. It doesn't cost the same to drive in California as it does in maybe rural Ohio. So it's different. And that's the challenge with this rate, right? It's really great and well calculated for your occasional back office driving employees who typically, hop in their car once in a while. But for our daily road warriors, those people who are field service, field reps, who could be in personal vehicles, it doesn't really make sense because it can over and under deliver. And those who traditionally transfer from a company perked vehicle to a reimbursement method, those higher mileage people are typically best suited for a different approach. And, the IRS standard rate, cents per mile, is not designed to be used in every single scenario. And that's why different IRS approved options exist, which we're going to be talking about now. So the star of the show in terms of common approach in transitioning people to personal vehicles from a fleet program is Favor. Favor, fixed and variable rate reimbursement, stands for just that, fixed and variable rate reimbursement. And essentially, think about it as a data-driven, tax-free way of reimbursing your active employee drivers who are using their personal cars. So this is a strategy that leverages both geographical and vehicle-specific information that influences a person's driving expenses. So things like where they live, what type of car they need to do their job. And then it reimburses the business portion of those costs relative to the real cost conditions and driving frequency associated with their job. And it does so using a combination of a couple things that are really familiar. So number one, an allowance, a flat fixed reimbursement, that flat allowance payment, and a per mile method, similar to the cents per mile conversation we just had, right? So when you're using market data to create rates for high mileage drivers, you're able to build something that is a lot more fair for your people, but also doesn't accidentally over or under reimbursement. And it's because of this data-driven approach that Favor is considered the most common approach for fleet transitions, and it's often considered the most fair for the employee and the employer. The data-driven nature, by leveraging an actual cost database to build employee payment rates relative to the real cost of driving in their area, allows us to reimburse not only in a way that makes the most sense, that keeps you the most cost optimized, but also keeps you 100% tax-free when compliant to regulations. And that's the really cool thing about Favor. Because of this, Favor essentially allows you to prove to the IRS, if you're in the United States, in a really granular way that every bit of money you're giving your people to drive their personal vehicle for work is directly attributed to that company required cost, to that company required policy. And therefore, there's no hidden income, right? It's a reimbursement, and there's no tax, and there's no over or under payment. That's the beautiful sweet spot that we're looking to find here. And Favor is eligible to be tax-free for employees who drive over 5,000 business miles per year. And that's the threshold that's important to remember. I talked a little bit earlier about being able to understand your employee population and kind of do the calculation and see, hey, does a reimbursement model make sense? Does the fleet model make sense? And as we kind of work through some examples, you're going to see how being able to understand your people's rates and their mileage is going to help you find the equilibrium between figuring out, hey, does it make more cost sense for somebody to be on a reimbursement program? Does it make sense given their job for them to be on a reimbursement program? And would it reduce my burden to have somebody be on a reimbursement program? So let's learn a little bit more about Favor. Favor rates, fixed and variable rates, I mentioned before, are built using market information. However, the rates are built off of the vehicle required to do the job. So I mentioned earlier, you might have sales reps in SUVs. You might have sales reps in sedans. You might have service technicians in pickup trucks, right? That is a requirement set by the organization. Often in fleet transitions, you might see a Favor reimbursement set up based on the same vehicle they had provided before, right? The fleet vehicle that they're coming off of. So it could be a midsize sedan, pickup truck, right? It all depends on your company and the requirements associated with the job in which the person is being reimbursed for. It also, a lot of the time, depends on the industry. And again, whether that person is a entry-level employee, maybe they're a merchandiser, maybe they're a senior manager. That all impacts their job and what they're required to do for their job. So once that's determined, employees are then reimbursed on the cost of driving this standard vehicle as determined by their job, but that cost right in their location, because as I mentioned, the cost of driving in rural Ohio is not the same as the cost of driving in California. And that reimbursement is broken down into two payment types. So first is the fixed payment. That's the allowance I was talking about before. So think of this as like a tax-free monthly car allowance. And that includes the business use of car ownership costs. So things that you are really used to covering in your total cost of ownership from your fleet today. So depreciation, insurance, license registration, relevant taxes, which should be zero in this case, right? But the fixed payment only covers the business use of those fixed costs associated with their personal vehicle. So typically what we see in favor programs is that companies will actually pick their business use around 71.4 to 75%. Why 71.4? Well, that's 5 days of the week, right? You might say your people are going to use their personal vehicle for work 5 days of the week, 71.4% of the time. Therefore, their favorable reimbursement will cover that percentage, the fixed costs associated with the work in that specific vehicle. Now, the variable payment is a little bit more simple. It's applied on a per mile basis, similar to cents per mile. Why? Well, these are costs that you essentially encounter as you operate the car. So it covers the operating expenses as they're incurred associated with the business mileage only. So these are things like fuel, maintenance, and tires. So you're reimbursing for fuel, maintenance, and tires based on the cost of the location the employee is in, but relative to the car required for work. So let's look at an example of how this is built in action and how you can bring this to life into your organization to make sure you're paying appropriately, but again, not overpaying, not underpaying, and keeping yourselves focused on your core fleet. So step one in configuration is essentially to input your driver's locations, input your people's zip codes and address data. So for this example, I think we used Vegas, love that city, great. Step two is to select the vehicle profile in which we calculate the reimbursement. So you might look at your fleet today and say, okay, our perk vehicles are Chevrolet Equinoxes. Great. Let's see what the rate would look like for reimbursing on a Chevy Equinox instead of owning that Chevy Equinox, right? So ask yourself, what's the basic type of vehicle required for somebody to do their job? What type of car do I want to use for the cost data that fuels the reimbursement? And how much does it cost to purchase that car? What's the MSRP? All this information is calculated on the back end. And then lastly, edit the details. Choose the vehicle's age, the business use percentage, right? How often are they driving that car? Insurance requirements for personal insurance, right? How much coverage you want your people to have, right? It's different than insuring them on behalf of the fleet. They have to maintain personal insurance. And then you adjust your inputs according to your goals. Tax-free, fair market, and non-overpayment rates will be created for each driver, keeping you happy, keeping them satisfied, and keeping them fully managed through the reimbursement process, not through the fleet asset management and safety management process that you're so focused on today. And a little tip is this: if you're looking to maintain fleet vehicles for a portion of the driver population within the same role itself, instead of making a full transition to reimbursement for a single population or a single job type, a best practice is to work with a reimbursement partner to find you, again, that cost break-even point for what mileage threshold makes sense to keep people on a company vehicle. And again, it depends on how you design your rate. But most reimbursement policies save companies around 30% per employee. That's across things like direct costs, indirect costs, personal use costs being ineffectively calculated, things of that nature, but typically around 30%. And of course, it's going to depend on your final rate, but typically we see some organizations keep a threshold of around 20,000 miles per year or 40,000 miles per year, depending on the type of fleet they operate, for when they know it makes sense to transition somebody back into a corporate vehicle. Alternatively, I want to offer you a third reimbursement type to enable your people to utilize personal vehicles in a way that best suits your organization. It's very similar to a flat car allowance that you might be familiar with. I mentioned it earlier. Those car allowances, you might just pay someone $600 a month, $500 a month, $800 a month to drive a personal car. But the difference is a tax-free car allowance or an accountable car allowance is associated with a specific IRS publication called IRS Publication 463. I'll save us the details. But it's an alternative method to reimburse U.S. entities, which allows organizations to offer a simple flat allowance for people who might not qualify for favor, right? Maybe they're lower mileage, maybe they're not as active. And it can actually be 100% tax-free relative to captured business miles. So in this scenario, I can pay my drivers anything I want. I could pay them $10,000 flat for the year, which I don't encourage you to do. I could pay them $600 a month, which is typically on average for a reimbursement program. I could even use favor, right? The difference is that they're measured for tax against the IRS standard rate. So I take their mileage and I apply that IRS standard rate. We talked about it earlier, 70 cents per mile. So for example, they drove 15,000 miles this year, times 70, that's, $10,000 in change, right? Then I compare that to what they actually got under their tax-free car allowance. Maybe I gave them $600 a month. So that's 12 months. I'm not good at math. Maybe that's $7,200 for the year, right? Only the difference between those two numbers is considered taxable income. So if I paid them more than what the IRS said I should have, if they were on the IRS standard rate, then I only have to tax the difference instead of taxing the whole amount, which of course lowers your burden, but also make sure that you're appropriately accounting for cost, right? As soon as you transition somebody to a personal vehicle, there's things to consider, right? You have to consider your cost, number one. You also have to consider your visibility. You have to consider your insurance, which we're going to talk about a little bit. But overall, when making that adjustment, ensuring you have appropriate data, like ensuring you have appropriate mileage data is so important, because then you're able to actually directly erode your tax bill. Because whether or not you're zero tax or you just have a couple change in tax, it really reduces your bottom line and your total cost of ownership if you can say, yeah, we were able to take 30% off the top because we can pay this tax-free because we're following regulations appropriately. And this specific approach, although less robust than favor, it is a good option for people looking to lock a reimbursement rate across a department or looking to keep things really, really simple. So this is really common for executive leadership. You guys on the team probably have executives on your fleet that have a perk vehicle today and maybe they don't drive much. Very common. They need that vehicle reconditioned, for example. And it happens. But in this case, you can put them on a really lucrative, attractive reimbursement program and simply erode their tax bill, allow them to drive the BMW they have at home, and reduce your management burden because you no longer have to worry about that asset. So of course, favors is the scenario I will mention. Favor is the only scenario in which you can pay over the IRS standard rate or its equivalent. So over that 70 cents per mile mark without paying tax. Favor is the only scenario in which you can do that, making it the most efficient way to reimburse highly while staying fair to drivers who perhaps don't need that perk vehicle. So let's consider a fleet that includes 220 drivers and has an estimated cost of $2.2 million. So this is a lower price tag than what we typically see, but this is just an example of one of our customers. So again, just a case study, but the cost per driver for this company sat at around $10,000 per year for this set of perk vehicles. And the company was motivated to change their program because they were uncomfortable with the variability in cost, number one. It wasn't necessarily high, but they were too unsure about the cost year over year for a lot of these underutilized assets. And their fleet managers were also significantly, tired and had a heavy burden with managing their perk vehicle fleet, which wasn't necessarily core to their business like their commercial fleet was. So essentially, they decided to reimburse their drivers for a mid-sized sedan personal vehicle instead. So they set favor rates based on the cost of driving a mid-sized sedan. And the reimbursement model really kind of totaled to around $7,000 per driver per year, which is a little bit less, including both the fixed and variable reimbursement. So this change allowed for around a 30% reduction compared to their baseline fleet costs. And of course, that's not accounting for things like unexpected variables of fleet and liability and accidents and things of that nature. And now again, not all companies are going to have the same motivators. Not all of you are sitting here thinking, I need to save money, right? Some of you guys might want to ensure that your costs are net equal. You might want to give people a really lucrative reimbursement. Maybe it's just about the liability, and that's okay. But understanding how to build a program that allows you to have that flexibility to adjust your reimbursement and to scale accordingly is really key here, because when you're locked into a fixed asset and you don't need it, that's where the pain comes in. Being able to see a lever and say, hey, I have a reimbursement program that will allow me to save, around $1 million, or if we're not really cost sensitive, I can pay people really lucratively and up that reimbursement and keep us competitive, but without the burden associated with managing that asset. That's really key. So it really depends on your independent motivators, but here's a really great example of how one-to-one you'll see some savings. So how does a company do this and ace the inclusion of personal vehicles? So in the next couple sections, we're going to talk about considerations when building a program. So I kind of alluded to this, but things like insurance, We'll talk about steps to selecting the program at best fit, effective communication, leveraging the right technology, and lastly, measuring success of the use of personal vehicles. So I talked a lot in the weeds about reimbursement programs today. So let's just bring it all together. In order to build a flexible and well-designed program that keeps you focused on your core jobs, in addition to taking into account various objectives from different stakeholders, we have to consider a range of factors. Number one, budget, right? Your team likely has a budget or a cost of ownership, a utilization metric that you need to stay to. So looking at that constraint and saying like, okay, what is the most important thing I need to measure against at the end of the year when I'm doing my performance review or when my fleet is being managed? Like, what is the core box I am in? That's the number one thing to consider. The next thing, of course, is industry and market standards. What are your peers doing? Do they all have vehicles? How do you know? How often have you checked? Same thing as the real cost of driving in everybody's specific area, right? Sometimes that's not perfectly mirrored by other, data in the market. And then lastly, of course, things like IRS compliance, transition planning, type of vehicle, and any internal policies. Mixed approach are very common and a great way to accommodate different needs. For example, we might see a lot of, some drivers using favor for high mileage, others using cents per mile for low mileage, and some of your commercial vehicles, of course, will be maintained for your active employee drivers. So just to share a little bit of an example here, the key is to categorize your people based on their actual needs and then match them to the right program. So when you work with a partner like CarData, we help you develop this for your specific organization. And here's an example of a company that we helped transition. Their goal was actually to get all of their vehicles that were not specialty onto reimbursement. And you really have to pair that with appropriate turnover cycles. So whether you have a fleet that is owned or fleet that's leased, it's really important to pair that to your retention cycle so that you're appropriately pairing people to the right reimbursement as they turn over. So in this case, we help them get their new hires on the appropriate reimbursement program, in addition to their current leased vehicles, pairing to a gradual move over to the appropriate reimbursement policy and personal vehicle policy when it made sense for their specific organization. So building upon the tailored approach, it's really important to also recognize that relying solely on a single vehicle solution is becoming outdated. I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about mixed fleet programs before we kind of jump into the Q&A for today. Now, we're beginning to see a really big adjustment towards fleet managers taking into account other methods of enablement into their policies. Now, of course, Favor is a good program for sales reps, fleet for service technicians. We're seeing a lot of mixing occur. So if you have a program that's specifically for example, only fleet vehicles, you might consider looking at other options. Fleet mix programs have actually increased 15% over the last year. So a lot of fleet managers are considering, how can I leverage personal vehicles appropriately? And when you do that, you need to make sure you're pairing it with a reimbursement approach of best fit for your organization. I'll just take a couple minutes to walk through how to leverage some tooling to make this easier, because at the end of the day, you're probably thinking, okay, this is a new program. This is more work for me. Well, it doesn't have to be, definitely shouldn't be. The goal of opening up a personal vehicle approach is that you're enabling more efficiencies without reducing any oversight, right? Without reducing any visibility or efficiencies internally. And by leveraging simple software, you can actually manage this change fully and take it off of your plate. So by choosing the right software and service provider, you can actually fully streamline all of this. So everything between rate design, which we talked a lot about today, between actually capturing the mileage needed for reimbursement, and then finally the reimbursement themselves, you can directly reduce costs, increase your driver's productivity, and save yourself time. So for example, if you work with the right policy, you're actually able to save yourself a week of work per year compared to previous capture methods, in addition to the fact that you won't have to negate any of the safety policies or the other elements that you are leveraging today, right? Just because they're in personal vehicles doesn't mean that safety goes away. When you use an end-to-end partner, you're able to leverage things like insurance verification flows, MVR tracking, and everything that's so core important to your business policy, but just in a different format, in a personal vehicle format, where maybe telematics don't make sense, but you still want to make sure that your people have appropriate insurance coverage, not only for IRS regulations, but also for liability reduction. And when you use the right partner and the right technology to do that, you can get it all serviced end to end and take it directly off your plate, saving yourself time. Amazing. Just to quickly highlight some core elements here, mileage capture is going to be end-to-end really important for any reimbursement policy. As I mentioned, it's core to tax regulation, but also core to visibility. You need to make sure that you've got kind of a replacement for typical telematics that are leveraged in company vehicles. And then I just want to mention, of course, reporting. When you leverage a personal vehicle approach, you're not going to do reporting the same way, but it is really core to making sure you're optimized. Getting appropriate data on the cost of driving in different locations, route mapping, compliance reports are still really important for personal vehicle reimbursement. It's just different. It's different because you're only looking at business required mileage and making sure that your people are safe on the road with appropriate insurance coverage, but also you're not liable for those off-hour accidents. When you use robust reporting tools, you're able to cover all of that succinctly with simple reporting that keeps you focused. And then lastly, I mentioned driver safety. Maintaining MVRs is core for personal vehicles, but of course, in a different capacity. You can make sure that your people are safe on the road by streamlining MVR reporting for every mobile employee, and you don't have to sacrifice that when you're pivoting to personal vehicles. You just look at it in a different light. I'll finish up here at business reviews. The work doesn't stop when you launch the program. It's really about making sure that you're effectively measuring on your key performance indicators. So whether that's a cost reduction goal, whether that's time saved, you wanted to save a week of work per year, you wanted your people to save a week of work per year, you have to continue to report on those metrics appropriately. On metrics like total cost of ownership, as I mentioned, productivity, time saved, and of course, compliance. I'll close this off with a case study. I worked with a company called Hers recently, and they actually were debating, do we move all of our fleet employees to personal vehicles? We don't really know what to do. And of course, they have a large commercial fleet for distribution, but they ended up offering it as an option, personal vehicles as an option. And at the end of the day, 60% of eligible drivers preferred favor right away. They preferred reimbursement. They wanted the flexibility, right? They wanted money in their pocket every month. They wanted that fixed reimbursement in their pocket every single month that enabled them to drive the car that they wanted. And you too can explore this option with the right partner. It's just about, making sure you design a program that makes sense, but also keeps you in compliance, keeps your people safe, and keeps you focused on your core job, ultimately reducing your burden. Understanding we're on a time constraint, I'm going to pass it off to Chris for some questions and Q&A. Thank you so much.
Sure. Wow. Well, that was a lot of information covered, Lee. And we do have some questions that came in, and we got a little bit of time left here, about 7.5 minutes. You touched on how mileage is captured, but let's get into that. I mean, there's apps, there's obviously telematics, but how does it connect to the car data system?
Yeah, good question. So personal vehicles are a little different than fleet vehicles because from a telematics perspective.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's true.
Right. And, a lot of people, when they're driving their own personal car, they're like, hey, don't put a plug-in in my car and follow me home on the weekends. So what we see a lot of people do in personal vehicles is that they actually leverage software instead of hardware. So they're leveraging applications to capture mileage. And there's a lot of really intelligent mobile applications, car data specifically. If you do leverage like an end-to-end partner that creates the rates, gives you the mileage capture app and does the payment and the policy verification, the policy creation, then the application is able to capture the mileage. You don't have to use telematics anymore. You're able to use flexible software-related reimbursement that allows them to turn off the tracking on the weekend, right?
Okay, and I guess it's driver turn off, turn on the app type thing. So the driver doesn't have to manage that. Yeah.
Exactly. And you can set schedules to do that, right? A lot of people, they might work 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Maybe they work different hours. You can actually just set a schedule so it does it automatically. So there's no burden on your people. But the goal is so that they get paid for those miles accordingly, right? So this is an incentive to make sure that miles are captured effectively.
Under TFCA, I mean, is it the driver's responsibility to report the amount to the IRS?
Great question. I think this is from Lisa. No, it's not actually. So if you leverage a fully managed reimbursement partner like Car Data or something of the sorts, it's actually the company's responsibility to essentially take the tax report generated by your partner and simply apply it to W-2s at the end of the year. So similar as they would to income tax. They're only taxed on the delta, so only the relevant income, and the employer does it fully at the end of the year. It's very simplified. And guess what? If they drive enough mileage, there's no tax at all. So if there is any, it would just be applied on the employer's side, and then it's directly helps the employee get paid with less tax.
Okay, great. I wanted to get into mixed fleets as it relates to EVs, but I did want to ask a question that you touched on, and it is really in getting everything together for favor. It would seem a bit of a burden on the fleet, the company, to have to get everything. How do you leverage that? How do you help in that regard? Getting all the vehicles in there and all that data.
Oh, great question, and that's why it's so important to leverage a partner for this. And I say that because nobody wants to sit in-house and design favor rates for every location across. It's impossible almost, right?
Yeah.
So the way we do it is if we partner with a team, we say, okay, send us your list of drivers that are going to be eligible for the program. Just tell us. We reach out and we do it for them. Yeah, we do the end-to-end method. So like capturing they just left it all in the app, and then we do the calculation. That's it.
Well, that's an easy answer right there. That's great. Yeah. Hey, so EVs, totally different scenario when you're having to measure energy coming from a house type thing. How do you handle that?
Yeah, EVs is such an interesting topic. Love to talk about EVs. EVs are very new wave when it comes to tax, because you've got EVs from the sense of sustainability and corporate regulation, and then you also have EVs from the sense of how the IRS and government bodies look at EVs. So in terms of calculating the cost of reimbursing an EV, there's a lot of methods to take. And if you work with a partner like CarData, we actually do have EV vehicle profiles, meaning you can leverage data about the cost of reimbursing for an EV and actually create EV company profiles that you can then say, hey, driver, here's a reimbursement for your EV. Very, very easy. The other method to note is that the IRS has not recognized EVs as separate than combustion engine cars yet. They haven't. There's no tax regulation that makes combustion engine different than an EV. So what a lot of partners will do today in 2025 is they actually leverage combustion engine reimbursement rates, and they incentivize their people to drive EVs because they get to take home a really nice pocketed fuel reimbursement that they don't need for their vehicle. That variable cost, they don't have fuel. So those are two unique strategies. You can either base your reimbursement on the cost of driving an EV and create policy that makes that very lucrative and exciting, or alternatively, you're able to give your people a nice take-home advantage because there's not yet IRS regulations that prohibit that. Now, one day when there is, of course, CarData is doing a lot of research on charging data and how to incorporate more robust charging data about statewide cost of electricity into reimbursement rates, which is, of course, very exciting for the reimbursement space. But overall, a bunch of fun ways to incentivize EV usage that can further reduce your carbon footprint.
On that note, is there any risk to a fleet manager that is reimbursing, and with this gray area with the IRS right now, how do they stay on the right side so they're not going to get in trouble later?
Oh, great question. So if you work with a partner who is suited and well-versed in policy and has a team of people who are suited to monitor the market and work in the realm of tax, you never have to feel like you're alone in navigating all this new policy, right? Especially with the rise of AI too. Like there's so many new things coming out these days. It's like the .com bubble again, right? There's all these new things coming out with EVs. So don't do it alone is my first recommendation. CarData has been in business for 25 years and always at the forefront of regulation. And that's why we build solutions before they're needed, because we want to be at the forefront of what's coming in the reimbursement space.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, listen, I know we're not going to have time for any more questions. Any of the questions we didn't get to, we're certainly going to send you an email. Thank you, Lee. That was such a great amount of information. I believe this will be archived so folks can go back and view it again. But thanks for the great presentation today. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.